Thank you for joining me once again on this very humid, stormy day with less than ideal lighting. It was so nice and bright, and then it just got like so dark so fast. Today is just going to be like a fun throwback little moment where I felt like reminiscing about some of the movies that I watched as a child into my teens maybe. Like, we're going to go back to the era of the VHS rental.
Welcome to Blockbuster Video.
My name is Lydia Foxglove and I am a fantasy author. And a lot of fantasy authors cite as inspirations, you know, your classic fantasy novels and sometimes your classic 80s fantasy movies even, like Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, Neverending Story. I watched all those, of course, but I wanted to talk about some of the not as common ones because people forget just how much magic there was randomly in all kinds of movies throughout the 80s. There was a lot of like paranormal romance. Some of them were super dark. You got a whole mix. I still maintain that the 80s and 90s was just like the peak moment for movies because people were still going to the movie theater very frequently, and we also had VHS rentals, so like it was a good time for movies. Some of them are not good in hindsight, but a lot of them still are. And I miss that experience, you know, like the first movie rental place we actually had, we did not have a movie rental place when I was really little. We would go to a gas station. It was at the corner down the street. And this is a pure Florida memory because things have changed so much that it was just like this lonely corner. One way went to Chuliota, which was a bunch of nothing. And the other way went to like downtown Oviedo. And then you just had the lone gas station. You go in there and they had like movies just kind of jammed in. You could rent a VCR as well because a lot of people didn't have VCRs yet. We didn't have a VCR either, but my dad would usually borrow a VCR from work. It was a special occasion. We could find a movie at the gas station. And then when I was, I don't know, 7 or 8 or something, they opened the Mega Movies. And from there on out, for some years, it was a real treat to go into Mega Movies. I don't know like where the movies of Mega Movies came from because in my memory, a lot of them were already kind of old when the Mega Movies opened. Like, I don't know if they had a stock from somewhere else or they bought like used ones or what. It just kind of seemed to be like it had always been there almost as soon as it opened. So a lot of what we rented was not new because the new movies always like cost more. You had to return them faster. So you just kind of wander around the like cheap older movies part and find whatever looked interesting to you. It was rarely anything new and hot. And my parents were not the type of people who really gravitated toward like the hot action blockbuster or anything like that. So I did not see a lot of those movies. I still have yet to see Jurassic Park or Ghostbusters. So that kind of tells you what sort of childhood I had. What did I see? Well, the first movie that I remember being obsessed with was The Secret of NIMH. Since we didn't rent movies too often in the early days when we did not yet have a VCR player ourselves, it was a special occasion, and every time I would go right to The Secret of NIMH, and if it was there, it'd be like this one. And I remember at one point my mom being like, "Do you want to get a different movie?" As moms and dads throughout history have attempted, like, please, can you not watch the same movie just over and over and over? And of course, the idea of renting anything besides The Secret of NIMH, like, why? Why would I want to watch anything else? The Secret of NIMH, I still feel like The Secret of NIMH is a little bit underappreciated, even to this day, because the animation, the atmosphere of The Secret of NIMH is just, so good. And something about it that still strikes me to this day is that it is about the main character is an adult mom, female mouse. Like, you know, she is an animal. There were a lot of animal characters in animated movies for kids, but like she's definitely an adult, a widow, and she has like children she's trying to protect. And I can't think of very many other stories that have like an adult mom as the protagonist. I think it was the maturity of this main character that really attracted me as a kid, because I was like one of those kids that was like an old soul, and I really was mainly attracted to very old characters. Like, I would pretend to be Jiminy Cricket. Out of all the characters in Disney movies that you could be, I was like, I want to be the cricket mentor. So I would also pretend to be Mrs. Brisby. Very easy costume. I had a little Red Riding Hood cape left over from Halloween, underwear, and a red cape, and you're good to go. Like all those Don Bluth movies of the 80s, it was dark. And that darkness and maturity sticks with me to this day. And the sense of wonder of going into this underground world. I think that partly inspired the underground realm of the dragons that is lit by crystals in my Kingdoms of Sky and Shadow series. I think the most traumatic of those movies was The Land Before Time. Like, that movie, I don't remember it very well. I just remember that as a kid, that movie just like wrecked me. There is such a level of sadness and bleakness to The Land Before Time. That was a little too much for me as a kid, but there was also something kind of compelling about it. I think that some of the best children's entertainment is actually a little dark. Like, kids kind of crave the darkness, even though we joke about it. Like, oh, we can't believe we watched such dark things as kids, or that we made such dark things for kids. But, like, kids want and need that unless they're extremely sensitive. And of course we had the animated Disney movies. Little Mermaid and Aladdin were my favorites, and I had my first original paranormal world I created was after Aladdin came out, where I basically mushed the two, and I had a world of mermaids and genies, and my mom was watching The Young and the Restless every day. So I took the concept of mermaids and genies from Disney, but all the plots were taken from The Young and the Restless. So I had a genie who was an alcoholic. He was troubled by his former life as a genie who was not free. So even though he was free now, he had not gotten over it, and he was an alcoholic, and he had a beloved ex-girlfriend who was a mermaid, and he had a current girlfriend who was a genie, but then he broke up with her, got back together with the mermaid. Then there was a bunch of catty drama. You know, I'm sure that was what Disney intended kids to do with those characters. Another animated movie that left an impression at the time, FernGully. I don't hear people talk about FernGully much anymore, but there was like a moment in 1992 that was just all about FernGully, where you had fairies living in a forest. You had a bat voiced by Robin Williams, which that in and of itself was enough for any child of the early 90s. And then you have like this environmentalist plot line where they're trying to destroy the fairies' forest or gully. It was a super, super early 90s movie when environmentalism was at like its peak moment before people decided that it was a big political issue that we should be divided on. In 1992, we were teaching kids to protect forests was not yet controversial. I have a feeling this movie would not hold up for me now, but at the time, it was quite delightful. But one animated movie that partly sent me down this weird rabbit hole of memory was I was remembering this weird Pinocchio movie that it used to come on TV. Like, you'd have your VHS rentals, sure, but you'd also have the random ass movie that would appear on like a Saturday afternoon that you would just end up watching, like whatever happened to be on. We didn't have cable or anything. I feel like this movie aired several times on like a weekend afternoon. It was called Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night, and all I remembered about it was that I recalled it being really dark. So I watched a couple reviews of it just now before making this, and there's like this scene, and it's like takes place after the Disney Pinocchio, although it was not made by Disney, but clearly that's what they were going for, to the point where Disney tried to sue them. And Pinocchio gets turned back into a puppet, and there's this scene where he's like on strings, and he's being like manipulated by this creepy looking bad guy, and like a single tear falls from his eye before he fully becomes a puppet again. And then there's this girl that he's kind of in love with, like a puppet girl. It's kind of hinted at that she used to be a real girl, and there's a point later where you see this whole thing of all these children turned into puppets. So there's a lot of I don't know, your kind of 80s body horror for children getting turned into puppets and then back again. So my fantasy world has this race of doll people, and I've always cited that The Nightmare Before Christmas was where the idea came from. But thinking back on this movie and some of these other movies, the 80s was full of this. Okay, so first I had this dark puppet transformation movie with this Pinocchio movie. But then we also had Mannequin. This was another absolute favorite movie of mine when I was a kid that I watched a million times. It takes place in this grand department store, one of your peak 80s older big city department stores with a bunch of floors. The main character does the window displays for the store, and this mannequin comes to life, and she was like a cursed girl in ancient Egypt or something. It's like a really random backstory, but now her soul of this like Egyptian princess or whatever has been put into the body of a mannequin, and like she only comes alive for him, and when anyone else sees her, she turns back into a mannequin. So you have this like constant back and forth of her being real girl and then being a mannequin again. I also had one of the first, obviously in hindsight, very gay characters I had seen in a movie, even though nobody says that because it's the 80s, but I didn't know what that meant as a kid, but we all loved this character, Hollywood, and it was a fun time. But was that all as far as mannequins? No. We also had A Mom for Christmas, a Disney movie in which Olivia Newton-John plays a woman or a mannequin brought to life into a woman who becomes like the mother figure to these kids. And I don't remember this movie very well, but I do remember that I loved it. I was all about this mannequin trope as a child. And there was also some stuff with her like switching back and forth, mannequin to human. That was a big thing in movies back then, is like the supernatural phenomenon that has to be hidden from like normal society. So not only was I obsessed with Mannequin, but I was also obsessed with Splash, the movie about a mermaid who ends up on land, and if she can like take on legs, but if she gets wet, she turns back into a mermaid, and she's chased throughout the movie by like a scientist who suspects what she really is and wants to prove that mermaids are real, and then he captures her and like forces her to be turned into a mermaid and be in a tank. I liked A Little Mermaid, the Disney movie. That's all fun with mermaids, but I was super obsessed with the more dark and traumatic story of Splash. So all of my mermaid pretend games were always about the mermaid trying to escape her identity reveal and having to like confess to this man that she's actually a mermaid and being chased by an evil scientist and basically being forced back into her mermaid form, trying to escape. That was more in my wheelhouse because I liked characters that were continually traumatized. And speaking of dark, my favorite 80s fantasy movie as a child was Return to Oz. Debatably the darkest of the 80s fantasy movie classic lineup. One of the early scenes in this Wizard of Oz sequel has Dorothy being brought to an asylum where they're going to use some, I think it was like an electric shock machine or something. Anyway, there's this really dark scene in like a mental asylum where she's like strapped down. This happens really early on. You go in thinking like, oh, it's a sequel to The Wizard of Oz, and then what you get, so much better. I actually really like The Wizard of Oz too, but I resonated as like a intense child. I resonated with the darkness of Return to Oz, that then she ends up back in Oz, and Oz is just dark as hell in this movie. If you've seen it, Mombi and her heads, the villainess who has like a room of these different heads that presumably are people that she's like killed and she can swap out her head. So creepy even to me as an adult, but in in a kind of delicious way. But along with that mix of darkness, one thing I love to this day about Return to Oz is that it really captures the like Gilded Age pomp and style of the original books and the original illustrations, and the soundtrack is great. I don't think it's for sale commercially, but I managed to find somewhere that I could download it at some point. I listened to it many a time. It just captures that like early 1900s fantasy just so nicely. And as a kid, I was like a wee little goth child for quite a while. I went through a phase where I would only wear black, and I tried to get away with the black turtleneck as much as humanly possible, even though I grew up in Florida, so there's only so often you can wear a black turtleneck, but if possible, I would. And it was a good time for such a thing because Tim Burton was at his peak. So we got Nightmare Before Christmas. That movie just like blew my mind as a kid. Sally and Jack were just my ultimate couple for some years. But then we also had Pee-wee's Big Adventure. I loved that one. That funny yet continually disconcerting vibe of Pee-wee's Big Adventure. So good. Edward Scissorhands, Beetlejuice. And then we had the Addams Family. I was quite obsessed with the Addams Family for a little while too, and I remember renting that one, but since I couldn't afford to buy my own movies, so I did the poor man's way of copying a movie, and I recorded the sounds of the movie, just the soundtrack, onto a cassette tape and would listen repeatedly to the sounds and music of the Addams Family so that I could relive it after the VHS tape was returned. If you grew up in the modern era where you can just like stream movies, find things on YouTube, even the Netflix era where you still like had a DVD mailed to you, but it could be like anything, the idea of listening to a movie on a cassette tape sounds so sad, but that's what I did. Another core movie of childhood, The Secret Garden. I just saw someone post on Instagram the other day that they were in love with the like uncle. I think he was the uncle. And I hadn't thought about the uncle before, but you know what? The vibes of Secret Garden though, like the whole concept of having a secret garden and the contrast between, you know, nature boy Dickon and broody Edwardian sickly boy Colin. That was just, you know, it was a kid's movie, so it wasn't a romance, but the vibes were all there anyway for like a classic love triangle. Frances Hodgson Burnett was one of those authors that I loved, and she didn't actually write fantasy novels, but like they might as well have been, because The Secret Garden is one of those novels that just feels like a fantasy novel even though it's not, and I would say the same for A Little Princess. It has such a fairy tale quality, and there's also a version of The Little Princess, I think it was a BBC, but it aired on a show called Wonderworks, where they would show different adaptations that I think were mostly British of different like classic children's books and so on. We loved Wonderworks, and my favorite Wonderworks airing was The Little Princess. If you go watch it now, like it definitely has that sort of like low rent feel to it, but it's a great adaptation of the story. Nevertheless, it's so enjoyable. Much better than the film that came out a little later, which I did not really like at all. And what I got out of those two stories was like how you can infuse the fantastical and like those balances of light and dark even into more mundane stories. Say Pippi Longstocking was another one that was good for that. And that was my sister's movie that she watched a million times, to the point where I was like, can we stop with the Pippi Longstocking? This is my middle sister, so she's 2.5 years younger than me, and she just went through that phase where she was just watching Pippi Longstocking like every day, to where every song I can still to this day recall the damn Pippi Longstocking theme. Watch out, world, 'cause here she comes, the girl who never thought she couldn't do something. This is probably not the best lyrics ever written, but she's also one of like the great unschooling icons, I would say, because, you know, she's definitely the weird homeschooled kid that I was as a kid. I wasn't as over the top as Pippi, but I'm sure to some normal children that we would encounter, they probably were like, we were their weird hippie Pippies. Now, was it all darker movies, fantasy movies? No, there also was Steve Martin. It's hard to describe the level of like reliable star power that Steve Martin had at this time, like the 80s through at least some of the 90s, that a Steve Martin movie could be equally enjoyed by the children and the adults in the family, and a surprising number of Steve Martin movies actually do have some kind of fantasy component to them. You've got All of Me, where Lily Tomlin is sharing a body with him. You've got The Man with Two Brains, where he's falling in love with a brain. The Steve Martin movie that influenced me the most was, as I had previously discussed, My Blue Heaven, a rather silly mob movie. But my second favorite was LA Story, which was had a magical realism component. It takes place in LA. It's got your peak LA 90s vibes where LA just seems so magical, and there's these billboards throughout LA, and just for the main character who's like a weatherman, and he's kind of falling for this woman. I don't even remember what her deal is anymore, but the billboards would like flash messages that were just for him, and this all culminates in this scene with this sweeping Enya soundtrack, which is just not what you would expect, but it was one of those movies that had like this hint of peering into another type of world, even as you're in the real world, kind of like Field of Dreams in a way. I love those types of movies, particularly at this time frame. In the 80s and 90s, they were really good at infusing just a certain sense of mood and magic into our real existence. Also should give a shout out to Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, a Steve Martin and Michael Caine movie in which they both played con artists. It was a remake of an older movie, which I've never seen. But I think between My Blue Heaven and Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, it kind of gave me that love of like the rogue character. And then to close it out, I also just want to give a shout out to Shelley Long's character in Troop Beverly Hills. This is not a fantasy movie, but this movie enthralled me, and I think part of it was just Shelley Long's amazing wardrobe and the confident, charismatic air she projects throughout this film while playing this wealthy Beverly Hills socialite who becomes the leader of this fabulous Girl Scout troop, the Beverly Hills Girl Scout troop. At this time, I almost always identified with male characters in stories because female characters were often just kind of slotted into certain types that I didn't really identify with as a kid. I was more interested in characters that were like either had tragic pasts with a bunch of, drama and brooding going on, or were like just kind of fabulous, quirky, the rogues and the weirdos, I loved Auntie Mame, which was certainly the gayest movie I had ever seen until actual truly gay movies started to come out. And then we had Shelley Long in True Beverly Hills just being so fashionable, so fabulous, so like charming, a little arrogant, she was so fun. I love those kind of characters to this day. They're not always popular with every sort of reader, but whatever. I love a good kind of arrogant rich girl with a good heart, and I credit the origins of that to Troop Beverly Hills and Auntie Mame. Now I would love to know what movies from your childhood really stick out to you, whatever generation you're from. If you're a writer or an artist, what movies like really inspired you, and what is that movie from your childhood that is so weird and random and forgotten now? No one remembers it, no one talks about it, but it's wedged in your head forever. Drop all that in the comments. This should be a fun one to talk about. If you'd like to read any of my books inspired by these movies, although I don't know if you can tell, there's a link in the description. My July free book of the month is The Sorcerer's Concubine. The main character is from my race of doll people that was inspired by The Nightmare Before Christmas, Mannequin, and Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night. And if you'd like more from me, I have a Substack and a Patreon and YouTube memberships where you get 2 bonus videos every month voted on by you guys, as well as access to my Discord. But either way, Thank you so much just for watching and being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. My name is Lydia Foxglove, and I talk about the creative life in general and writing in particular. So if that sounds good to you, stick around. And I will see you next time. Bye!